So today's episode is about the gut-brain axis. We've been hearing about it more and more. So doctor, can you explain to me what is the gut-brain axis and why is it important?
Sure. It's actually quite simple and quite complicated at the same time. The gut-brain axis, people tend to think of the vagus nerve as being the main channel. That's the superhighway. But it's a bit like with your computer. You can either plug it into a wire as a LAN and you get data, but what you have to remember is there's also Wi-Fi. So there is information that comes from the gut which is transmitted through the lymphatics and the blood vessels, which circulates throughout the whole body and up to the brain. So think of that as Wi-Fi. It takes a bit longer. Okay. And there are all sorts of linkages with the nerves. It's not just the vagus. There's the whole of the sympathetic nervous system. The whole autonomic system is involved. And one of the things I always found interesting was why lymph nodes have a nerve supply. Why it was always thought it was just nonsense, but there is a genuine reason for that nerve supply, because that's the land that carries information. So the gut senses what's going on in the lumen, the where the bacteria sit in your poo and your food and things. But there are cells whose special job is to detect what's going on inside that. And this is where immy comes in, because immy passes through the gut. It's not a colonist of the gut. It doesn't colonize. And it triggers these special responses in these cells, which are then transmitted, when we know the path, through to the brain. Mm-hmm. And the information is stored there. But interestingly, the gut-brain axis we now know is a two-way street. We always thought of it as one way, and that's a bit against the rules in biology. There's always a two-way street to try and shut things down or change or respond. And so we now know that the brain can send information down, particularly through the vagus. We don't know about the Wi-Fi yet, and inform immune cells in the gut how to behave or what to do. And that's fascinating. And immy certainly has an effect on reducing the inflammatory process. It has a very powerful effect in the experimental models. I mean, we can't go around taking bits of people's brains out, right? But we have models. And we know that it has an effect on reducing inflammation, particularly in the brain. Mm-hmm. And that is relevant to all sorts of things, because if you're stressed, brain inflammation goes up. If you are ill for whatever reason, we see inflammatory changes going up. If you're getting old, you develop things like neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. We know that the inflammation is a factor in all of these things. So chronic inflammation, as opposed to acute inflammation, chronic inflammation is the thing that we have to deal with, and what immy is particularly good at shutting down. That's why immy is important.
So how exactly does inflammation in the gut affect the brain?
Well, in multiple ways, but inflammation in the gut is transmitted to inflammation into the body. And then that's carried up, if it's in the gut, through the gut-brain axis, and it then affects the brain itself. So we know that if you're not feeling well and you've got a gut infection for whatever reason, you feel ill in terms of your mood, your ability to sleep, headache, whatever. It's a very powerful response. So the secretion of either products from the bacteria in the gut are absorbed into the system and then carried into the circulation through to the brain, or the immune response is carried through the nervous system. Either way, it ends up in the brain, and it causes things not to function very well.
So a lot of people don't even think about this, but if you have a bad gut, you basically have a bad brain.
Well, it probably isn't firing on all cylinders. It's just like having a dose of flu. If you've got a nasty flu, you feel terrible, and you don't function. You just want to go and sleep and lie down somewhere, and your sleep isn't very good, and so a disrupted immune system is just not going to help, and it will affect the brain.
And so overall, what does chronic inflammation look like in the brain?
Yeah, chronic inflammation in the brain is triggered by and causes. It's a sort of plus and minus. Stress can do that. So if you're very stressed, you can get problems in the brain, and vice versa. So when you're not feeling particularly well, you've got inflammation, stress is going to be a problem. So what we really are more concerned about, changes that occur in the immune cells in the brain, where they start demonstrating poor function. And that seems to lead to all sorts of problems, in particular things that worry us, like neurodegenerative diseases in the long term, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease and stuff, which we still don't know for sure how that all happens. But we think a chronic inflammatory process that goes on and on and on and on will then cause damage to the nerve cells. We know that some 20 to 30% of the brain structure is composed of immune cells. These microglia are basically macrophages. They are a particular kind of immune cell that we understand quite well, and they get inflamed, and that's not a good thing when they constitute 20 to 30% of the brain's constitution, right?
So I mean, there is this emerging evidence that there is a connection between having constant inflammation with these neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and like dementia. I mean, we previously thought it was genetic, but it looks like you can acquire it over time by giving yourself chronic inflammation.
I don't think there's any question that can happen. And of course, the genetic versions, we know that there are several conditions which have a genetic propensity for dementia. The best known one is called Hutchinson's chorea, or Hutchinson's disease, where it's an autosomal dominant. That means half the children of an affected person will develop the disease, probably coming on at about 40, 50 years of age. We know a lot about that and how there's a particular genetic defect that leads to damage in the brain, and it's not a nice disease. But hopefully very soon there will be some very good news in terms of how to deal with it. But that takes us to the majority. These are rare by comparison to Alzheimer's, which is on the increase, and Parkinson's and all these other things. So we need to explain why it's such a problem. Why is it increased? And we think it's probably part of this problem of modern life, that we live in a more inflammatory milieu, that inflammation remains constant, and it's not doing us any good. And anything that will help to reduce chronic inflammation has got to be a good thing, we believe. Mm-hmm. And of course, the evidence we have from studies with immy is that by reducing the effect of inflammation in the microglia, we will hope to reduce any damage in the rest of the brain tissue.
And therefore reduce the onset of these neurodegenerative diseases.
Yeah.
It's like we don't actually know if this is we don't have research on the full ramifications, but no one's ever asked, like, oh, how do I get dementia? But it probably is related to being chronically inflamed.
It almost certainly is. And the problem is the research has not been easy, as you've probably read in the papers, and it takes time. I mean, dementia doesn't happen in 5 minutes. It's a disease that takes 15, 20 years to evolve sometimes. And you got to wait for it.
Okay. So when people are saying, I've got a gut feeling, what's happening there? It's like you've got this adrenaline cycling and you feel an emotional response more than a rational or maybe a logical one. Is that what's happening there?
Yeah, that's a different component of the, if you like, the brain and the rest of the body. That's the sort of pituitary adrenal axis, hypophyseal pituitary adrenal axis. And that's to do with adrenaline and cortisol and stuff like that. So if for example, you've had a near accident in a car, mm-hmm. and we've all had this sensation of that funny feeling in the pit of your stomach and that sudden thing, that's adrenaline.
Okay.
Causing, so which is different. But of course the nerves are clearly involved because the sympathetic system becomes hyperactuated, and then that settles down usually. So that's a process that has if you like, a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's a normal reaction. If a lion is coming to attack you, the adrenaline comes out, you get that terrible feeling in your gut, and you either then fall down and get eaten, or you run like hell, right? So that's an acute response, and that gut feeling is different to what you might expect from a more long-term process.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if you have chronic stress, that axis, the HPA axis as we call it, does get triggered, and you release cortisol. And if you remember, cortisol is an immunosuppressant. It's a drug that suppresses immunity.
Mm.
So again, chronic stress with chronic cortisol production is not a good idea, because that reduces the inflammatory. That's an anti-inflammatory, if you like, but it's not in a good way.
Directly compresses your immune system and your ability to respond.
Yeah. So in a way, that's more suppressive, and it doesn't allow you to react as well as you should to all sorts of things. So it makes you more susceptible to infection, makes you more susceptible to, all sorts of things.
The dementia and the Alzheimer's.
Well, I don't know that necessarily dementia. That's a much more chronic inflammatory process. That's a sort of positive as opposed to a negative.
Right.
In a way, you're almost shutting down the inflammatory process, and you're exposing yourself to attack, as opposed to a kind of repair or damaging process, which is what chronic inflammation is trying to do.
Interesting. We spoke about fecal transplant, and we spoke about fecal transplants in the last episode. But you cited a really interesting study where a fecal transplant can actually help adjust in your mental and neurological conditions as well, specifically as a byproduct.
Yeah, this was a fascinating observation. So there was a patient with dementia, Alzheimer's, who developed Clostridium difficile, which is this hospital-acquired infection that's very resistant to antibiotics. In fact, it's usually induced by having too many antibiotics. And the treatment, the perfect treatment for that at the moment, is a fecal transplant. So he was given a fecal transplant, the C. diff went away, and his Alzheimer's got better. And that was a case report that's been reported in the literature. And so that was a serendipity, if you like. So hang on a minute, how did that happen?
So they got a fecal transplant for a non-neurological reason, but his conditions
improved
regardless.
Yeah. So there has to be a lesson there, right? It's like one of my friends said, if you throw 100 tennis balls off the top of the Empire State Building and 3 of them float, you got to explain it, right?
Exactly.
So how do you explain that? How did he get better? And my view is very simple, that the fecal transplant induced a beneficial effect in terms of his chronic inflammatory process. And, the inflammation in his brain settled down, and so did the Alzheimer's. How good was that?
Incredible. So the donor who provided the feces for the transplant must have had something that was positive in their sample that contributed to
possibly. That's the problem with fecal transplants. The donor is not always easy to work out. We know, for example, in twin transplant studies where identical twins, one may be obese and the other one thin, or one may have diabetes, the other one doesn't, and you do a stool transplant and you can correct the defect or even trigger the defect on the other side.
Incredible.
And that's fascinating. But we don't know what is actually responsible. Which bacteria is it? They'll take a stab at it, but I told you there's so much dark matter in the microbiome and in the stool. How do we know what it is? And just to prove that, we know in fecal transplantation for C. diff, you get a 94% response rate, a cure rate, which is, compared to 40% for an antibiotic, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But so everybody thinks it's the bacteria. But if you ultrafiltrate the stool of the donor, you ultrafiltrate it so there's no bacteria in it, and you do it, there's an 80% response rate. So you've got to think, well, hang on a minute. What is it that's doing this? Again, it needs explanation. Is it viruses? Is it bacteriophages? Is it small things that got through the filter? There's something else going on that we haven't as yet worked out. So, watch the space, and when we find out, we'll tell you.
Right.
It's really interesting, the stuff's going on. This is why we think immy is so important, because we believe that adding something like immy into the equation enhances that interface between the microbiome and the patient or the person's immune system, and enhances the response.
Yeah, I almost see this like information highway happening between your gut and your brain at all times. And maybe there's congestion, maybe there's a car accident and the signal is getting blocked. It sounds like immy is that protector that helps kind of streamline the connection between the gut-brain axis.
Well, the immy itself isn't getting up to the brain,
right,
which is fascinating, but it's the signal that is induced in the cells in the lining of the gut. And again, we don't completely understand it. We know which cells are involved, but we don't know what the signal is. But that, you're right, the signal may get corrupted in some people, and in a car crash.
Or get confused and bogged down by bad bacteria, maybe get confused and bogged down, and we don't have the proper, I don't know how to describe this, but we can get confused and bogged down and may not interpret the signals correctly.
It's possible, but the good thing is there's Wi-Fi and LAN, and we think that at least if the LAN gets clogged up, just wait a bit and the Wi-Fi will get around, because you get humoral. That means the cells in the blood and the lymphatic can go around and eventually reach their way. So the nature is wonderful about having more than one pathway to deal with a problem. So it's likely that those signals, these cytokines, as they're called, the immune signals, are then transmitted through the system.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that the gut is part of the nervous system?
Oh, yeah.
How would you define it in terms of relation to our nervous system, the autonomic nervous system? What role does it play?
Well, I mean, the gut has a fantastic innovation. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of nerves from both, but in particular, the autonomic nervous system. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the parasympathetic or sympathetic system.
Fight or flight response.
The fight or flight or whatever. The vagus is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which deals with the motility of the stomach, acid secretion, cardiac, heart rate. There's all sorts of things that the vagus does. And which brings the interest, if you like, to vagal nerve stimulation that's become very
popular.
Yeah.
The little vibrators for the neck.
Yeah. The Alderman's nerve. Do you know about that?
No.
No. Well, so there's a little nerve. There's a little piece of skin just by the ear, which is about the only sensory supply that the vagus does. It was always thought to be a motor nerve, but it's more complicated than that. The Alderman would be the fat mayor type guy. You need to have a big meal, and he, to help himself digest. This is the old days. They would put their finger to their ear, and they I promise, honestly, to stimulate that bit of the vagus. They didn't know it was the vagus, but they knew that if they did that, it would help their digestion and their stomach to empty. And it was called the Alderman's nerve for that reason. And so, of course, there is now, you can buy a nerve stimulator which has got an electrode that sits just at that spot. And that may be why it works. But I think you've got to be a little bit careful with vagal nerve stimulation, because it can be positive and it can be negative. And I can explain that if you like. Shall I explain that?
Yeah.
If you inject a toxin called endotoxin into an experimental animal, a rat, and you put it into its abdomen, it has a septic shock. It dies of septic shock. The immune system will kill it. If you cut the vagus nerve of that rat, it survives. It does not die of the endotoxin. So that's fascinating. However, if you put endotoxin in and you stimulate the vagus nerve with a nerve stimulator, it has the same effect. So if you cut the nerve or you stimulate the nerve, you seem to get the same effect. Now, how do you explain that? And the answer is, I don't know how you explain it, but I wouldn't go messing around with a vagus nerve stimulator unless you knew exactly what you're doing, other than the Alderman's nerve, because I think that's really good.
Okay.
So you can try that and
I'll report back. I'll start moving it on.
You've had a meal, just do that and see. Yeah, it'll help your digestion.
Well, so I'd love to know more about a balanced nervous system and how it relates to sleep. I think it's very clear when you're balanced, you can regulate your mood, right? If you have some kind of equilibrium, you have stressors, you're able to regulate and kind of respond to stress better. How does a balanced nervous system apply to sleep when you're imbalanced? What's the biological response?
Well, sleep is complex, as you know, because there are different modes of sleep and times of sleep and rapid eye movement sleep, etc., etc. And there are lots of toys out and actually quite good machines.
We have so many.
Yeah, they are. The Aura Ring that we may talk about that later, which monitors your sleep pattern. And so it's a pattern. It's not an individual. You're not either asleep or you're awake. There's a lot of things going on whilst you're asleep in terms of resetting the computer, cleaning out memories, storing memories. There's a lot of computing power going on in the brain. All that requires energy. In fact, the brain consumes most energy in your body. And everything is predicated towards preserving the blood supply and the energy to the brain, right? If you're in shock or bleeding, whatever it is, it's the brain that is protected. So the energy is probably the underlying situation. If your energy is not being directed in the right place, the brain's not going to function properly. You're not going to feel right. And that's where, again, if there's an inflammatory process going on, it is wasting energy. Inflammation wastes energy because you're fighting.
Sucker.
Yeah, you see, so
vampire.
They're like a vampire, right? So energy is depleting the brain's ability to do what it is supposed to do whilst you're asleep. And if you don't sleep well, you don't correct. You don't get rid of memories. You don't store them. You don't get the rest that is required and the recuperation that your brain computer requires. And that's probably to do with energy. And anything that reduces that energy loss, like inflammatory loss, is probably a good thing for the brain because the system is designed to protect the brain and to enhance energy to the brain.
We were talking previously about how immy helps to power cellular respiration and also support energy production. How specifically does that do that for us?
With immy?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. We just published this paper on diabetes. And diabetes, again, is all about energy.
Right.
And in the model that we used, we were able to demonstrate that taking immy, and in fact, it works really well. It protects you from developing type 1, which is the insulin-dependent diabetes. We haven't looked at type 2, which is the other, the non-insulin dependent, because that's a bit more complicated. But in type 1, this very clear model, there is a benefit. And what we saw when we looked at details was that it was to do with the energy production, which is, they're called uncoupling proteins. Don't want to get bogged down with those. But in patients who waste energy, immy seems to have an effect on preserving and correcting that. So that's probably one of the reasons why patients that we saw who had cancer, and patients with cancer waste away, they become hollow-cheeked, they lose weight. It's all part of that awful process where the cancer is stealing the energy from your body. It literally does that.
Energy suckers.
It sucks away your mitochondria. Mitochondria are the batteries, your energizer, bunny, powerhouse. They steal. It's incredible. It steals the energy and it uses it itself. And when those mitochondria puts it back and gives you the rubbish mitochondria, which is why you feel so awful. But that cancer cachexia, that wasting away of cancer, was something we noticed did not happen with patients who were on Emobuensi and Vacai, which were the precursors. We published that data a long time ago in lung cancer patients, that there was a quality of life signal, and it's been published, by the way, in tuberculosis patients, where the weight loss was not as severe when those patients were given Vacai.
That's crazy.
It is. And we think that it's to do with this process of the effect on the uncoupling proteins that does it. So we have some science besides what we didn't spend that money was not spent for nothing, right? I mean, it's a lot of money. We have a lot of science, and we're still doing that science. And there's a new publication will come out on the oral use of and protective effect in the model on diabetes. And there's a lot of other stuff that's going to come out, which we have to keep quiet about.
Well, hopefully not for very much longer. But it's really interesting because when people think about fatigue or low energy, they don't associate that with brain fog, but basically fatigue, low energy, brain fog, inflammation, right? Yeah. And so we're always seeking to lower the inflammation effect that we have on our bodies. Specifically for sleep itself, people oftentimes take adaptogens like, lion's mane, GABA, maybe L-theanine, other types of vitamins or supplements that will support sleep health. These supplements typically address mood, right? So essentially to ease into better sleep, they're trying to create a more relaxing effect, be it through magnesium or L-theanine. And how does that relate to your sleep? I mean, I guess the question is more like, a lot of supplements are targeted to help improve sleep quality.
Sure.
And will immy do the same thing?
Well, we have relied on reports from people who take it, and we've been seriously impressed that one of the first effects that people comment on is that they're sleeping better.
Oh, that's
And
great.
I think that that is a feature of the reduction of chronic inflammation, because as I said earlier, chronic inflammation eats energy. And usually there's a lot of toxic cytokines, there are a lot of signals going on. There's a particular agent called interleukin-6, which has this effect. And so when you have flu and you feel terrible and all the rest of it, anything that reduces that inflammatory process is going to have a benefit. And what's impressive is that it's been measured and people have commented, particularly those who've got Oura rings, and they can actually get an objective. So somebody saying, yeah, I think I slept better is one thing, but somebody saying, look, my Oura ring signal actually shows the figures is actually much more impressive. And what we would like to do is a more formal study to try and get more information and hard data. And
we should track our Oura data with this one.
So I still think it's to do with a disrupted immune system causing smoke, if you like. Those signals of smoke. And it's also to do with energy consumption. The energy that you're burning that you don't need to burn doesn't do you any good.
Yeah, it's getting wasted.
Yeah.
Speaking specifically about Oura rings and sleep, we actually have a real immy customer review here. I'll read it. I had seen the ads and thought I'd give it a try. My stress had seemed to be uncontrollable recently. I've been using it for a little over 2 weeks now, noticing a feeling of a lot less out of control and not freaking out as much, despite all the other factors remaining the same. I've also noticed a psychological improvement in my Oura ring score, with being able to have more restorative time on my daily stress monitoring.
Well, there you go.
Could be really interesting to find out, to run a study.
Yes, and he's not alone, that person, and it's great to have that kind of feedback, and we welcome it. I think it's really important to collect this kind of observational data. It has real value, and if he's had this benefit, well, how great is that? Thank you very much.
I mean, I've always said that my greatest fantasy is 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep.
There you go.
If immy can get me there, that's all I'm asking for. I mean, sleep issues, anxiety, stress, they all seem to be chronic stressors and constant for especially a younger generation.
Yes.
Gen Z is really known to be the anxiety generation.
Yes.
And we got an interesting comment. We've got an interesting review here from a customer. Immy has been the only supplement ever to get almost 100% rid of my lifelong anxiety. I didn't realize how much of a difference it made until I forgot to take it for a couple days and the noise in my head came back so loud. Also, I was having some kind of lingering mystery sickness with fevers, nausea, dizziness, and body pain off and on for a few months, and it's gone since I've taken this. I'm a different person. Wow.
Yeah, was she describing almost what people would call fibromyalgia?
Yeah,
these aches and pains and all that thing. And one of the big problems that I've noticed throughout my career is that most doctors, particularly general practitioners, don't believe in the existence of fibromyalgia. You can also think of it as post-viral syndrome, myalgic encephalopathy, yuppie flu. Because when you do the blood tests, all the tests are normal. And it's very frustrating for that patient when they go and they know something's wrong. They go to see the doctor does the test, and basically what he's saying to them is, look, this is all in your head. Go get a grip and, stop being so stupid.
Doctor gaslighting?
Yeah.
Oof.
Well, there you go. So it's taken long COVID to teach us that actually this is a very real phenomenon. And in fact, probably 20% of the people who have COVID are getting long COVID. And in fact, something like 15 or 20% of the young population in the US have got some kind of effect from long COVID. And it is a post-viral syndrome, which is where the inflammatory process has not settled down. The virus is still there. We know that COVID gets into the nerves. We know that and that it persists for many years a bit like herpes virus, the cold sores.
Oh no!
Yeah, the herpes virus sits in the nerves and can lights up when it gets a chance. Yeah. So,
breaking news: long COVID affects your nervous system.
It does.
I didn't realize that.
Oh my goodness me! Yes, it very much does. And A, gets into the nervous system, but B, it has this effect on your mood and anxiety and all these things. So long COVID is a real problem. And it's only now that the medical establishment has suddenly said, oh, hang on a minute, post-viral syndrome really exists. Now, to do the blood tests, you really have to do more sophisticated blood tests than the usual stuff your ordinary doctor would do. You've got to do immune studies. And even then, what you have to do is to stimulate the cells to demonstrate that they're not functioning as properly as they should, right? So it really is important that people realize that actually this is real, because after a while they begin to think that they're imagining it, that there's something wrong with them, and all that does is just add to the anxiety. If you think that you're that you're a nutcase, and your doctor's telling you there's nothing wrong with you, it's even more stressful, right? It's not helping anybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But one of the great things is that and Lyme disease, by the way, is another one which people accept. The tick-borne thing is something that we know makes people feel ill. And we've had reports of people with Lyme disease, post-viral syndrome, that have benefited from having this chronic inflammatory process brought down and helped them.
We might need a whole other episode for that one, because the idea that you have chronic conditions and you can relieve some of the symptoms with that, with immy, is really powerful. But as I'm reading these reviews, all I'm reading is about the anxiety relief that these customers who have tried immy have received. How exactly can you say that how exactly can you explain how immy has this amazing response to your mood, amazing response to anxiety and stress relief or stress recovery?
Well, as I think we explained, when we realized there was this effect in cancer patients who had lung cancer, they were terminal lung cancer patients who had no hope and really should have been devastated with the diagnosis. And the fact that those that got the equivalent of immy, the precursor,
right,
we could tell immediately, because the minute we couldn't blind the study, because the minute they walked into the room, they had a smile on their face. They didn't lose weight. They were different people. They were coping with the anxiety and the issues. The other people were miserable. They lost weight, and understandably so.
Real, tangible, physical improvement in mood.
And that's what prompted Chris Lowry, Professor Lowry, the neuroscientist at Boulder, to start say, well, there's something strange going on. And we published a paper on the quality of life signal that these cancer patients had. That was published by Mary O'Brien years ago. And Chris Lowry's studies on the experimental animals showed that by giving them these mycolysibacteria, they were triggering serotonin secretion in the brain. And as you know, serotonin is the happy molecule. So at the very least, that was the first observation. And then as time went by and they did more and more studies, they realized that it was actually an inflammation that was the problem. They were reducing inflammation in the brain of these subjects, and therefore they were getting much better responses in terms of anxiety, in terms of coping behavior, and resilience.
So reducing inflammation improves resilience and the coping for anxiety and stress.
No question.
It helps to produce the secretion of serotonin, the happy molecule. And what you're telling me, breaking news, is you don't need medication to get relief from anxiety and stress. You don't have to take other sorts of drugs that require prescriptions that are potentially harmful for your health, but you can actually just regulate yourself via the gut system.
As always, these things have to be discussed with your doctor.
Of course.
And therefore, if you're already on some kind of medication that is helping, you need to discuss it. And because some of these medication, you can't just stop it because the side effects are not great. But if you are, you haven't gone onto medication or anything else, and it's something that you feel you can cope with, then it's worth trying it. What have you got to lose, right?
I would do it. I would do almost anything to get rid of anxiety. If you feel like that heart pumping, that beating, and you just want to calm, you don't feel the calm. And I think if that is all truly related to inflammation and reducing that on a daily basis can only impact the quality of your health.
Unquestionably. But at the end of the day, if you find that it doesn't work for you, you definitely need to seek medical help because, life isn't always quite that simple. There may be something else going on that is triggering it that needs to be dealt with. So, you need to have a holistic approach. You've got to treat the whole organism, the whole patient. You can't just say, right, immy is the cure for everything. But on the other hand, for anxiety and that kind of thing that we've seen, the results have been really quite astounding and very gratifying.
Yeah. But is there any research about Myceliaceae bacteria affecting cognitive health or just cognitive function broadly besides, inflammation and mood?
Yes, interestingly, the work has been done on a precursor called VACI and also on BCG,
Right.
which is the vaccine that is used for tuberculosis, Bacille Calmette-Guérin. But anyway, and that's just too punchy. But on studies, they've demonstrated an increase of intelligent behavior in animal models.
No
So
way.
yeah. So if you put a rat in a maze, right, and you work out how long it takes to do it, and then you give it immy, it seems to do it much better. Their cognitive function seems to improve. Now, whether that happens in humans is another matter. But generally, if you are able to reduce your stress levels and to get yourself settled down, you're going to function better anyway, aren't you? I mean, if you're trying to do a maths exam or something and you're all stressed out, you're not going to do it very well, are you?
No.
So de-stress, it should help you.
Yeah. I mean, it could be a correlation or versus direct causation, but to be smart and more intelligent, to reduce stress, to reduce anxiety, those are all net positive.
I would love to be smarter without Emmy, but I do the best I can.
I think you're more than well qualified as our chief medical officer. You mentioned this story before about this bully mouse. And so what I'm thinking is not only are you more able to cope with the stress and anxiety, but it also promotes mental resilience in almost like the positive and forward way.
Yeah.
What is this, like this mean mouse study?
Oh, it's a great experiment, again done by Stefan Rebo, who's a professor in Germany, and Chris Lowry, who I've mentioned in Colorado. And it's fascinating. If you take a colony of mice and they're very happy living together, 4 or 5 mice, and they talk to each other, they're very friendly, and they give each other a hug and a kiss and all, and they're absolutely great, right? And what you do is you bring in a mean mouse, if you like. We call them a bully mouse. He's a nasty piece of work. He's bigger than they are.
He bites them.
And he's a meanie because he bites them. He takes their food. He does all sorts of unspeakable things to them. And the poor little mice, the other ones, they're terrified. And they cower away, and you can see them, trying to hide in a corner. Some of them bury themselves into sawdust, try and get away from this nasty piece of work. And he's horrible, right? So what you do is you give them Myceliaceae bacterium, and they'll defend themselves. They'll beat him up.
No,
Yes, it is wonderful. So they say, right, okay, I'm not having this, and they'll fight. And the poor mouse, but he gets shoved into a corner because they put up a fight.
This is mental resilience.
Mental resilience. It's a great model for resilience, isn't it? And I think it's great that, I'm all for dealing with meanie mice, sorting them out. So
the mean mouse is basically me living in New York City. New York City is the bully mouse, and it's always bullying me. It's a taxi, a city bike about to hit me at any time. And this is building the mental resilience.
And you wonder why you get chronic inflammation, right?
As a New Yorker, I'm very intimate with the idea of being chronically elevated. If you've ever been almost hit by a city bike, you would know that your heart is in your throat and you just kind of feel like you can't really recover that well. That's actually a chronic elevation that we spoke about previously.
Yes, and we've, that's been well demonstrated again by Chris and Stefan Rebo. I think I told you they took some city slickers who'd never had exposure to animals and then lived in the city all their lives, and some people who worked on a farm, and stressed them. They did a particular kind of stress exam, which we won't get into the details, but you measure their stress responses, be it adrenaline and interleukin and these other things. And what's fascinating is that the country lads, they show a big spike in adrenaline and everything because they get stressed. They're not used to this stress. And they show a spike in their immune responses as well. But very quickly, it goes back to normal. So they get the response. The city boys, they're slightly elevated, but it wasn't significant. But they don't get such a big adrenaline drive because they're used to, all that chronic stress. But they also don't get such a big immune response. But what happens is it takes a much longer time for them to come back to normal. So that recovery, if you like, of the recovery index for them is much greater than that implying that they are chronically inflamed. They're just not responding right.
So the city slickers are failing the stress exam. We're getting Fs because we are getting elevated and we're staying elevated.
Yeah. You haven't got time to recover. You're not recovering properly.
I hate getting Fs. I would love to get an A.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so specifically for the gut-brain axis, and to wrap up here, I'm curious, from a doctor's orders, from Dr. Akle, how do we improve our brain health? How do we nurture our gut-brain axis? What are things that we can look out for and look after ourselves?
Well, again, you have to take a holistic approach. I mean, it's great to take immy and think that's all you need to do, and for sure you should be taking immy. But you should also be doing other things like keeping yourself mentally active. It's very important, especially as you get older, that you keep mentally active and you don't just sit there watching television and do nothing else. You've got to keep physically active. And that doesn't mean having to run marathons or go mountain biking or whatever it is. A nice gentle piece of exercise for half an hour a day, a walk in the woods, that kind of pattern of exercise. Get a dog. I mean, that's really...
We're really pro-pet here.
There you go, pro-pet. And then make sure your diet is properly looked after, that you look after your microbiome garden, as we've discussed before, that you feed it prebiotics, you make sure that your fiber intake is adequate. And that's a very easy task, given that the American diet is so lousy in fiber. It doesn't take long to shove the fiber up, and start with gentle soft fiber, Metamucil or something, psyllium house, and then introduce tougher fiber all the way up to from oat bran to wheat bran if you want. Make sure that you eat lots of fermented food. Make sure that you vary your diet, so there are lots of nice colored fruits and vegetables and things that you can get in there. Sure, have a steak every so often. Why not? Don't go and eat processed meat, ultra-processed food. Bad idea.
We can skip that.
Yeah.
It's interesting you brought up consistently nurturing brain activity and motor coordination or physical activity, because you told me a story in the car earlier about an enlarged hippocampus for taxi drivers. So you're telling me that taxi drivers have significantly larger hippocampus?
London taxi drivers.
London-specific taxi.
Well, especially London taxi.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that if you're a New York taxi driver, getting from one point to another is really easy because you have a grid pattern. Right?
I feel like there's some patriot bias coming in here.
No. I love the American.
New York taxi drivers are cool, but the London taxi drivers have to use their brain more.
Well, they have to, because there isn't a grid pattern. The city of London grew organically and is utter chaos compared to New York and more
on a grid system.
Yeah, the grid system is easy. You go First Street and X whatever is really easy on a grid pattern compared to go and find Smith Street in the city of London, and it's so difficult. And to become a taxi driver in London, once upon a time, the famous black cab, you had to take a 3-year course, and you had an examination at the end of 3 years.
Oh my gosh, it's like law school.
A little scooter, and you had to go around all the streets of London for 3 years before you were able to get what was known as the knowledge. It's called the knowledge.
The knowledge.
Yeah. And that means that you then went for the exam, and the examiner would say to you, right, I want you to go from here to this such and such a street. And you would have to be able to describe every street that you went to, because you'd have this picture in your head, and you turn right at this street, left at that street, going, because all the streets are completely jiggled today. And you'd have to find the quickest route.
Or else you get charged.
Or so you don't overcharge. Of course, now with Uber and all the rest of it, they just use GPS. So it's a bit, but the original London taxi driver not only has an enlarged hippocampus, by the way, so do pigeons, because homing pigeons have exactly the same thing.
They're on their own system.
But they also have a reduced risk of Alzheimer's. Now, isn't that interesting?
Really?
Even though it's quite a stressful job. So the London taxi driver is a great example, if you like, of how your brain can adapt to a complex situation. It's plastic. It's not just there and set and finished. You got to work at it.
Yeah. It's kind of introducing consistent brain challenges will help power cognitive health and longevity.
So, yeah, I do. I try and do the Times crossword every day. And I don't know, it drives my wife mad, but it keeps me, I think, sane.
I mean, I'm willing to support it. I think introducing new activities to give your brain new ways to develop neural pathways, especially because they're saying longevity sports are what? Racquetball, swimming, tennis, dancing. You're always using motor coordination in a different and varied way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good thing. I mean, that's why that combination of exercise and cognitive skill, because if you're playing tennis or whatever, it's not just a question of exercise. You're also having to outwit your opponent and, decide where you're going to put this thing. So all of those things are good. And I mean, if you go down to Florida, you see the number of 90-year-olds still playing tennis. Okay, they don't leap around like
True ballerinas.
Yeah, but there's 90 years old still playing tennis. It's not bad, huh?
Yeah, we've got to find new ways to nurture the brain. Use it or lose it,
There you go. It's a muscle.
So that's all the time we have today. Thank you for talking to me about the gut-brain axis. On our next conversation, we're going to be discussing chronic illnesses, all the cancer, neurodegenerative diseases you spoke about, some of these autoimmune conditions, and how we can alleviate that with immy.
With pleasure.
See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.